Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Today is Friday, and we do a program called Mythbusters. Our co-host is Chris Rossini. He is also the editor of the RonPaulLibertyReport.com. Chris, welcome to the program today.
Great to be back, Dr. Paul. Thank you.
Good. I assume you have a few challenges for me?
Yes, today we're going to talk about market prices and how government consistently messes them up. Now, before we begin, I'll just talk about market prices. Prices are the lifeblood of the market economy. They provide valuable information to each and every one of us as to the supply and demand of any good or service in the entire economy. So they're extremely important, and they help us to allocate, all of our scarce resources, whether you're an individual, a business, organization, all of us. Now, in order for this to work, market prices need to be accurate. The information that they give us needs to be as accurate as possible and as true. And in order for that to happen, it has to be hands-off. Government can't intrude, because whenever government comes in and tries to manipulate things, it takes the information that's supposed to be accurate and turns it into lies. And those lies distort the economy and really mess things up. And that's what we're going to cover today. And we'll start with a very hot topic these days, and that's healthcare. Everybody's so fed up with healthcare in this country, but we have to find out how we got here. Now, Dr. Paul, you have firsthand knowledge, being a doctor, as to what it was like to practice medicine back in the day when government was relatively hands-off versus today. So please compare those two times and how we got into this mess.
Well, they accepted this myth that the government is responsible to provide medical care for us. And this has come about because medical care is very important. But their logic is absolutely opposite of what it should be. The more scarce a product is, the more you need a pricing structure. And I remember wage and price controls during World War II. It should be when you really need to market because there's such a scarcity, but no, they put on control. I remember dramatic changes occurring in 1971 when Nixon put wage and price controls on. There was problems in the economy and prices were going up, and he wanted to control inflation but didn't want to talk about monetary policy. So he put wage and price controls on. It wasn't a week or two or three. Shortages occurred the very next day. That all of a sudden, prices were fixed, and that meant you had to purchase certain things at a fixed price, and therefore shortages came up, and then the black market arose rather quickly. So you're absolutely right. The pricing structure is so important. But we've given up on that rather early on medical care because medical care is so important. But that means we should be very, very interested in the marketplace. But what has the government done, and what has the medical profession done? They've moved in the direction of more controls and more monopolies over it. Licensing is a form of monopoly, and the doctors were participating in it, hospitals were participating in it, and the Bleeding Hearts participated. We'll give you free health care. It continues. The worse it gets, the more they promise free stuff. But now, alternative care is very difficult to have. There's prohibitions against it. And then once the government gets involved, they start protecting certain groups, like the drug companies. Republicans are responsible for the prescription drug program. And look at the cost of drugs. If you have to pay for the drugs yourself, they're sky high. There's no marketplace, and it has to do with licensings of drugs. Even generic drugs, importers can get a license for it, and they can be the only ones, and that's why you see medications that cost $10 a pill cost $300 a pill, and even much more when you get into the very important drugs for, say, cancer therapy and all. But it is true. I practiced medicine for a short period of time where there was minimal controls. I left medical school in 1960, and I was involved in medicine then. And one thing I observed back then, and I worked in a Catholic hospital in San Antonio when I was in the military, that nobody was turned away. Everybody had medical care. and they were either not charged or the very lowest. As soon as government came in or third-party payment came in, you divorce yourself from the patient. You don't look the patient in the eye and say, this is what it's going to cost. You send the bill to third party, and it's always the maximum because they might not pay it, and so you pad the bill, and hospitals have done that. So it completely distorts the marketplace. And of course, with that, you end up with a lot of shortages. The extreme of socialism, there's always a shortage of care. But we never had true free markets. They were relatively free in the 50s and the 60s. I remember my dad telling me that when I was born in 1935, he sent me the bill and it was $36 for the whole delivery. And that was the price of an ounce of gold. Today, it would probably take you 10 ounces of gold when you go into a big hospital and have hospital bills and doctor's bills and all that. So there's been tremendous inflation. The other thing that happens is once you divorce the interfere with the doctor-patient relationship, the prices do go up. We all know that, but the quality of care goes down, and that is what we've seen. But then to fix the problems, you always introduce more people come in. Well, we got to get the prices down, so they start regulating prices and they interfering. But it turns out that the drug companies get to write the regulations, on the drugs. So it's absolutely impossible for a system to work like that, and we're moving in the wrong direction. A lot of people say, well, we don't need socialized medicine, and that's what Obamacare is all about, and Obama's a socialist. That isn't the case. He's a corporatist. He's a sort of lends itself toward fascism, where big business and big government get together. So Obama didn't stop it. I mean, he's helped the insurance companies, he's helped the healthcare companies, and then when they get involved and they get drawn in, then they get unhappy and they never can get enough. So it's the corporations that end up controlling things. The patients suffer the most, and it all comes from this myth that it's the government's responsibility to provide health care. There's absolutely nothing in the Constitution that says that is the case. Now, that does mean that there's a prohibition against local governments doing something, even though I think the freer the market, the better. Most people don't have any confidence in people and prosperity and markets and generosity. We still, in spite of all this mess now, we still have the Shriner hospitals, and we have certain clinics where you can go and get total free health care. In a Shriner hospital, if there's a burn patient, they provide total free care. So there would be so much more of that it would be available. But there's a few people now branching out in the medical profession to have their own hospitals private, and they undersell everybody else. But they reject insurance, they reject the government, they take a lot less in fees. They're happy, and the patients are happy. We shouldn't be so frightened about free markets. If we really care about people and we want to give them the maximum amount of care, give them the best doctor-patient relationship, you should free up the market, and you should not have prohibitions against people entering the market. That doesn't mean anybody can put a sign up and say, I'm an MD, but they can offer services. There's a tremendous amount of medical services that can be offered. Alternative care now basically has become illegal. It's over-regulated, and even nutritional products can be over-regulated. So it's a terrible, terrible system, and unless we get more confidence in taking care of ourselves and understanding that works better and rejecting this trend toward acceptance of Obamacare, unfortunately, right now, I do not see anybody on the horizon that really will change the course of Obamacare and government intervention. The main thing that we should do to preserve a little bit of dignity in medical care is legalize the option to get out. And that's one thing Obamacare didn't do. It was a mandate. So if you allowed just the ability to get out, believe me, there could be a tremendous improvement in the healthcare system. Thank you on that subject. Chris, what else do you have?
Next, Dr. Paul, we're going to move to another area that government has messed up with the market prices, and that's education, higher education specifically. And we're going to draw, once again, on your own personal experience, because you paid your own way into college, which today is virtually unheard of. Today, you're expected to get a government student loan, and government's there to help you. And in their helping, they pumped over $1 trillion into higher education. And if you throw $1 trillion at anything, you're going to cause prices to skyrocket. And that's exactly what happened. Kids are now loaded with debt. So Dr. Paul, please compare once again to what you experienced versus the system we have today.
You know, the myth, of course, is exactly the same as on medicine. Where does this come from where people accept totally that it's the government's responsibility to educate the children? That was not part of our early history. The parents were responsible or the church was responsible. But now it's the obligation of the government to provide education, and if they have trouble, make sure it's free. Never really challenging. Of course, a lot of debt has run up, but we've lived with an educational system for 100 years almost. They say, oh, debt deficit doesn't matter. And both conservatives and liberals have accepted that notion. But it is true that I was raised in a family. There were 5 boys, and we all had jobs. And I was able to just save from mowing lawns and delivering newspapers over quite a few years and having a nest egg for me to pay for the first year of my college. And the one thing is, my brothers and I never really worried, where's the money going to come from? How are we going to pay for college? We just knew that if you had a little bit here and you worked, it would be taken care of. It wasn't too expensive. My first semester at Gettysburg College was $325 tuition, and it just didn't seem too high. And I would have 2 or 3 jobs on campuses at the fraternity house. In summer we worked. I delivered milk and furniture and a lot of other things, and it wasn't hard to get that amount of money. So government comes in and they decide, well, that's too much. Some people can't afford it, so we're going to make sure that everybody's taken care of. And so they come in and give grants and very low interest loans, and like you mentioned, Chris, there's $1.3 trillion of loans outstanding now, student loans, which will be written off. They're never going to pay that. And the price goes up, education cost goes up, quality goes down, and yet there's still the ability to opt out, a little bit more so in education, even though it's very difficult for the average person. But legally you can opt out. You can get an education on the internet. I happen to have a program, the ronpaulcurriculum.com, that offers education at a reasonable price at home, and it's a self-starter type program. There's private schooling. There's a lot of other options other than just paying more and more, especially for the college education. You can get an education and get a decent college degree, over the internet. So I did see what was happening now before about the cost of education and our ability to take care of education one time. It's not available right now to the psychology of the individual that doesn't believe he has the responsibility. At the same time, due to inflation and interference, it costs too much, and unfortunately the debt is so heavily overburdened right now that it's a real problem. It's not going to get better until we accept the notion that it isn't the government's responsibility to educate our children.
Yes. Next, Dr. Paul, sticking with our government messing with prices, we're going to go beneath the surface on the next topic, and this may be new for some of our viewers, and we're going to cover obesity. And we all hear about the obesity problem in America. It's nothing new. And we all have also heard about high fructose corn syrup. And it's everywhere. You almost can't avoid high fructose corn syrup, and there has been ties to that, to obesity. But there's a reason why companies use high fructose corn syrup rather than sugar, and that's where I think most people don't know where that comes from. They're not just greedy corporations. They're making economic decisions. They don't use sugar for a reason. Now, Dr. Paul, please explain why sugar is not used as it's used all over the world, and instead, companies make the economical decision to use high fructose corn syrup.
Well, it's the lack of understanding about what tariffs do. And there are people still today want more tariffs, and there's unintended consequences. So the sugar industry for years, in spite of this age of trade agreements and free markets and low tariffs and all, it never happened. The sugar industry was strong enough to keep out cheap sugar. And therefore the fructose was much cheaper. So it was an unintended consequence of a government program. But the principle here is, the unintended consequences, but it's also the myth is that the government has some responsibility of what we put into our bodies. And I think that's a terrible assumption because it leads to the erroneous drug war, which makes no sense whatsoever, nutritional products, and then you have the First Lady telling us what to eat, and you have mayors of New York City telling you how big of a drink you should have, and all so-called well-intended pointing out these things. But where did the government get this authority? They don't have this authority to tell people what to do. The best way to undermine this myth is that most people know that the government shouldn't be interfering in our intellectual pursuits. They're not allowed to come in and regulate the books we read, even though with political correctness they're trying to. But no, most people would say no, they cannot interfere with intellectual pursuits. They can't undermine and interfere with our spiritual lives. And that's a pretty important thing. And just think of all the good and all the bad that comes from the reading of philosophies, bad philosophies, and all the bad things that come from sometimes out of religion. But government keeps their hand on. But when it comes to our bodies, the myth is that the only thing we have is the government to protect us and tell us what to do, whether it's doing bad things or how we should instruct people on nutritional things. And sometimes there are events that just backfire and interfere. But once again, it's a pricing matter that nobody paid any attention to, and I guess the corn people didn't mind doing this. They didn't complain about putting corn into our gasoline tank, and then they put this in everything, and it turns out it's a disaster. So now we have government programs that have to take care of people who are overweight, and they get sick from this, and then they never come along and say, well, why don't we just free up the marketplace and maybe it'll take care of itself. No, they say, no, the government has to do this and they have to dictate to it. And one thing I know with certainty is because people get overweight and get out of shape, they get their blood cholesterol and other things out of whack, and then there's a big promotion that the treatment for it is not diet and getting the government out of our way. It's a combination of the FDA and the drug companies pumping in more drugs to control these things that have been made abnormal through the interference of the government. So just as so many other things, the less government, the better. And certainly that would be the case when it comes to tariffs and sugars and fructose.
Yes, and finally, Dr. Paul, we saved the best for last, and that is the king of all price fixers, the institution that pretty much enables government to do the bad things that we talk about today, plus much more that we don't have time to cover, and that's the Federal Reserve, and it messes with the money supply and interest rates. And just yesterday, I read on CNBC a quote from, or they were talking about the St. Louis Fed chairman, James Bullard, and they said that he's undecided on the right path for interest rates. Now, Dr. Paul, please sum up this show with addressing this humongous error.
Well, this is tremendous news because the Federal Reserve is starting to recognize something they should have recognized 100 years ago. They have no idea what the interest rate should be, and it's only going to cause trouble if they do get involved. But they've done this more so in the last 30 or 40 years. But he's admitting the truth, and maybe it will lead to some wisdom, because one of the most important things, if we could only alter one price in this country today to help the economy and help deal with the business cycle, it would be to put a prohibition on the Federal Reserve that they cannot manipulate interest rates, and they cannot do that by manipulating the money supply. Of course, this would put them into hysterics over what would the Fed have to do if they can't pretend they know what the interest rate should be. But the price of money, the interest that they pay, is crucial, because if the price is lower, interest rates lower than the market, people make mistakes. Business people make mistakes. Savers make mistakes. Then there's overcapacity, overinvestment, and malinvestment. And this is what happens till finally they distort the economy so badly, and they won't allow the correction to occur, that all they can do is talk about how low can we make interest rate. When it gets down to zero, they can't lower them anymore, and that's why we're facing this major crisis. I often dreamed of the day that somebody in the media, either when I was campaigning or even now, get on a business station and and say, well, why do you talk about interest rates so much? Why is that so important? In a campaign, they would never ask that. They would ask political questions about, trying to develop, conflicts with individuals. But they never say, why is it so important about the interest rate? Well, it has something to do with the business cycle, and the business cycle has to do with recessions and inflation. And all these problems come from the fact of this total myth that there's somebody somewhere that's smart enough to know what the interest rate should be. The interest rate is set by the market, by millions and millions of people, if not billions of people, deciding what to do. And the real evil of this are the people who suffer from it. And the consequences are so harmful to the people they pretend they want to help. And that is to the middle class and the poor, the people who want to save. And on several occasions with different Federal Reserve Board chairmen, I've asked them, why do you do this? This hurts savers. This hurts the retired people. They can't earn anything. They want to take care of themselves. They don't want to go on the dole. And they can't earn any interest, and they just consume their wealth. And they admit it, and they say that's the case, but that's the price you have to pay. So they acknowledge it, but the greater good is to make sure that the markets are taken care of. But what they're saying, the greater good is served by making sure the stock market keeps going up. But that'll finally end, and everybody's going to suffer. But the other thing that it does is when there's all this borrowing, it allows borrowing and delay as long as this system holds together. But somebody else pays at a later date, as we are now. The recession now, and the students and the unemployment now is due to the inflation, the artificial interest rates that's been going on for 10, 15, 20 years. So we're at a crossroads right now. They can't continue to do what they're doing now. They don't know what they're doing, and if they continue to do this, the more they do it, the closer we will come to this collapse that will ruin the system, break up the system, and we will be forced to address this. Let's hope and pray that common sense prevails and people will come up and say, politicians and central bankers don't have any idea what they're doing, and they need a market economy. They need sound money. They don't need a central bank to create money and centrally economic plan through the manipulation of interest rates. The sooner we come around to that, the better. Chris, I want to thank you for helping us out here today on Mythbusters.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul.
Well, very good. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.